Welcome to the 8th edition of After the Flag. We're at the TT circuit at Assen and we have just witnessed something spectacular. Here we are then at the final chicane. Myself, Steve Day, Simon Crafar and Matt Burt to talk you through, or somehow talk you through what's just happened and what we've just witnessed here in as quick as time as possible. Apologies for the sunglasses, but the sun is absolutely beating down on us here. Where do we start? Well, I know where I'm going to start. I'm going to start talking to Simon Crafar because you made a great call just before the start of the race when you mentioned about the breeze picking up and the wind and the fact that it might affect the pace of the race and it might bring them all together. You were absolutely spot on.
Well, Steve, whenever I've seen wind like that, as a rider, you don't like it. You know, once it gets to a certain point, you know every turn into the wind where it hits you in the side, you have to go in slower, otherwise it pushes you wide. So you've got to go in slower. And then all the turns where the wind's supporting you, you can actually go in faster. But it takes a lot of calculating. And in general, it's a second and a half a lap slower. So that was it. Also, all the faster sections, when you're following someone, you get more protection from that wind and it's easier to stay with them. The guy that leads has to do the hardest job.
It's a day where Marc Marquez has taken victory and we'll come to that in a moment, but we've got to talk about the start. The race was absolutely epic, Matt. Jorge Lorenzo from 10th on the grid after his 2 victories in Mugello and Catalunya. What a moment for him as he burst through to take the lead.
A sensational, incredible, jaw-dropping start from Jorge Lorenzo, Steve. To go from 10th to 1st in just a couple of corners and then get the hammer down like he did. Us looking to speak to Marc Marquez after the race, and Marc was saying he saw this red flash underneath him at turn 2. He was convinced it was Andrea Dovizioso. He just did not expect to see Jorge Lorenzo there at all. Lorenzo tried to make the front running. He always felt that he was in trouble. He was surprised to lead for as long as he did, Steve, because he always said he was about half a second off in terms of race pace compared to Marquez. He hung in there for as long as he could, but of course there were some big moments along the way.
Oh, some huge moments. Simon, that moment between him and Rossi coming around into sector 4, I mean, that could have ended in tears.
That was, to me, that was terrifying, Steve. I mean, not just the speed, but I'll talk through how I see it happened. Going into that section, that right-hander, you have to get right up on the left, so on the paint on the left, on the throttle. You've got to close the throttle on the way in, so to get the bike to turn, and then so you can get on the throttle to get the right exit. But when he's thrown it on its side with the throttle closed, the front, Jorge, the front's gone, so he's gone past the area where you get the throttle on. Rossi hasn't. He's got the throttle on and gone straight into the back of him. I think the only reason that wasn't a massive crash was the front and rear tyre missed each other or didn't at least make a big contact. Otherwise, it would have been horrendous.
Well, Jorge Lorenzo unfortunately wasn't able to stay with the front group. He said he wasn't really expecting to. So in the end, he finished a bit further back. But we'll go to 5th place, Valentino Rossi. How many overtaking manoeuvres did Valentino Rossi make here today? Ultimately, it's not quite worked out for him, even though I'm sure he will feel he should have been on the podium.
Yeah, scary moments, including that moment with Jorge Lorenzo. But yeah, he'll feel, Steve, like a podium. Got away from him here today. He fought tooth and nail. We're standing here at the famous Timor chicane. If it wasn't already named the Timor chicane, they should name it after Valentino Rossi, because I lost count. You need a calculator to work out how many times he made moves on people up the inside of this final corner. Yeah. He was so determined to hold off Andrea Dovizioso, but we know Dovizioso, Rossi and Lorenzo, the 2 Italians, they are so strong on the brakes, and it was just basically a game of dare, wasn't it, down at that first corner. Valentino found himself squeezed on the outside. They've both got quite contrasting views in it. They're both sort of laying the blame at each other's door, but you've got to say in defence of Andrea Dovizioso, he had the inside line. They braked at the same point. Valentino just got squeezed out, but yeah, it was a real costly mistake, because without it, you've got to say Valentino was going to hang on to the podium. So in terms of the championship, it's dropped him 41 points behind Marc now. So yeah, it was a costly mistake by Valentino, but you could see why he was so determined to try and hang in there with Andrea Dovizioso.
Yeah, Rossi himself has actually said that maybe Dovizioso wasn't tactically smart to do that at the time, but it was just one of those races, Simon. I mean, there were so many moves going on.
Oh, you know, exactly. You can't really choose. The thing that stood out to me was Dovi didn't do what I expected. I had Marc for the win, Dovi for second, and Lorenzo or Rossi for third on the podium, and it was by halfway we didn't have a clue. You know, it was changing every lap.
And as for Dovizioso himself, I mean, even Marc Marquez has said in the press conference he expected Dovi to be there. I mean, I suppose he probably would have been, were it not for a few moments.
Yeah, fortunate to catch up with Andre after the race, and it's kind of a recurring theme. Unlike last year, Steve, where we know that Andrea Dovizioso and the Ducati was brilliant in terms of tyre management and managing the tyre consumption, well, this year they're struggling. He even said, despite the fact that he won the opening Grand Prix in Qatar, he was suffering at the end of the race. And he said today, basically, he was a sitting duck. The last 8 laps, he'd completely run out of rear grip. He was obviously fighting to stay in that lead group, but the problem was for the last 8 laps, he just couldn't hang in there, and it was a rear grip issue, something that they've not been able to figure out in terms with his riding style and the setup of this year's GP18 to match with the new spec Michelin tyres this year. So it's something that they've been thinking about, even though he won that first race in Qatar. Lorenzo said the same, they fell away with the rear tyre, and that's something that Ducati have got to work on to keep him in the game.
Well, we've mentioned 3 riders that were leading the race at some point. We have to now mention the top 3 overall. We'll start with Maverick Viñales, a confidence-boosting 3rd place. He's disappointed he wasn't obviously fighting for the victory, but hey, light at the end of the tunnel, because the thing is, he's managed to get off the line, worked well on a full tank, and he was really aggressive.
I think he did really well in the race. He was lost. He basically was a 10th off, wasn't he, at the end? And that's what Valentino's been saying for races and races, that they're 2 tenths off. You know, we're here and a bit more of a Yamaha track, they're 1/10 off. I think both those guys did everything they could, you know, did a fantastic job. But Maverick especially has got to be happy back on the podium, but also he didn't have that horrific start and have to try and work back from it.
Although he did go on the grass a couple of times, Matt, on the final sector.
Yeah, he did, yeah. I mean, Maverick Viñales had that big moment, didn't he, at turn 9 with Marc Marquez. Basically just a classic case of 2 really aggressive, strong riders just not wanting to give not an inch to each other, not a centimetre to each other. It got very close. There was clear contact between the 2 of them. They both went off the circuit. I think both Marc and Maverick felt at that stage they were both lucky to stay on board. The gravel was quite deep there. They pulled it back to 3rd and 4th place. But yeah, that was just one of a million moments that you could talk about in that race. It was breathless from start to finish.
Moving on now to the top 2, obviously, Alex Rins 2nd, Marc Marquez the race winner. You've always been an admirer, Simon, of Alex Rins' riding style and his talents, and he's come away from here today with his best ever result.
Yeah, I chatted to David Abrevio in warm-up online, you know, as you know, and I said to him, you know, do you think, you know, Suzuki with this flowing track and less about acceleration, and do you think you can get the result you can be proud of, you know? And they did. He said that it was really, his hopes were pinned on Rins because he could keep the bike flowing, didn't use the tyres as much, unlike Iannone, and it came true, you know.
And on to Marc Marquez. I mean, he had a few scuffles with Alex Rins himself, including that monster moment on the exit of turn 5, but he's outsmarted them again at the end of the race. He managed to find it when it mattered most.
Yeah, there was a few close calls. I think if you ask Marc Marquez next week how he stayed on board after that tangle with Rins at turn 5, he still won't be able to tell you. I mean, again, defying the laws of gravity, but Marquez, he just keeps his composure, he keeps his cool in the heat of battle, Steve. I mean, there was a season's worth of overtakes in 26 laps today, but Marc said this is a circuit where you've got to run the same lines if you can. You've got to be silky smooth, and when you're in a dogfight like that, you just can't do it. People are dive-bombing you from left, right and centre. Once he got to the front in those final 3 or 4 laps, he could get the hammer down, run his own lines and run his own pace. He was untouchable. Laps 24 and laps 25 today, Steve, just showed how head and shoulders above the field he is right now. Andrea Dovizioso and Valentino Rossi both saying after the race, we're almost in a fight now for 2nd in the championship. He's 41 points clear, Steve, going into the Sachsenring, where he's never lost. It's all starting to look a bit ominous.
Yeah, I'm with you, Matt. Marc, I loved his description of having to ride attacking but also defending, and that was so difficult. That's why he couldn't get away. I think that's a brilliant description, because to attack the guy in front, you've got to get out a little wider than him to get the engine driving so you can get up beside him to outbrake him. But as soon as he was running a little bit wide, Rins or someone would stuff it in the inside. So it was a great description. And you're right, once he got a little bit clear and could just absolutely throw everything at it, he was unstoppable. But he also said that he couldn't keep that going. He was absolutely physically wrecked by the last lap. So I don't think he could get away before that.
Well, it was a stunning day. It was a brilliant race and one that we'll never forget. Marc Marquez is in complete control of the MotoGP World Championship. We could talk about this all day long, I think it's fair to say. But from here we move on to the Sachsenring. From a classic at the Cathedral. We'll see you there. Alex Rins up the inside. Oh, Marquez! How has he not gone down? Oh, Dovizioso and Rossi together.
Marquez around the outside of the pair of them. He now leads. Where did that come from?
Marc Marquez wins an absolute stunner here in Assen. What a last 3 laps from the world champion.